The floor of the station cracked under my feet before anyone said a word. I felt it before I heard it, a deep groan that traveled up through the metal grating and into my bones, like the whole structure was clearing its throat. Alarms started a second later, a rising three-tone pulse that every species on the station seemed to understand instantly. Doors sealed themselves down the corridor. Lights switched from soft blue to hard amber, and every alien around me, tall ones with silver skin, short ones with too many joints in their arms, all of them stopped walking and looked up, toward the ceiling, toward the enormous structure suspended above the station that everyone called the lattice. I did not know what the lattice was yet. I had only been on the station for 6 days, but I knew enough to understand that when hundreds of advanced beings freeze in place and stare at the sky with real fear on their faces, something is very wrong. My name is Ellie Morgan. I am 17 years old, and 6 days ago I was living in a small town on Earth, worrying about a math test. Now I was standing in a corridor on an alien research station called Halcyon Array, watching the ceiling shake, wondering if I was about to die on my first week away from home. A tall alien woman grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a wall, pressing me flat against it. Her name was Dr. Vel Ashra, the closest thing I had to a supervisor here. She had pale gray skin, 4 long fingers on each hand, and eyes that never seemed to blink. She had barely spoken to me since I arrived, mostly giving me instructions in short, clipped sentences, as if I were a piece of equipment that had been delivered to her by mistake. Right now, though, her eyes were wide, and her hand was shaking against my arm. "Structural failure," she said, her translator device turning her words into English a half-second after her mouth moved. "Core resonance is dropping. Again." "Again," I repeated. "This has happened before. 5,000 years," she said. "It always happens again." I did not understand what she meant, not yet. I only understood that the shaking got worse, that dust fell from vents above us, that somewhere far below the station a deep pulse of light flashed through a window, blue, then white, then a color I did not have a name for. Then, as quickly as it had started, the groaning stopped. The alarms cut off. The lights shifted back to soft blue. Everyone in the corridor let out a breath at the same time, like a held note finally ending. Dr. Ashra released my arm and straightened her coat, composing herself the way an adult does when they realize a child has seen them frightened. "It is stable again," she said. "For now." I looked up at the ceiling, at the massive shape hidden behind reinforced plating, the thing they called the lattice. Something told me this was not simply a piece of station equipment. Something told me this was the reason I had been brought to Halcyon Array in the first place, even if nobody had explained it to me yet. Dr. Ashra walked away without another word, her long strides carrying her down the corridor toward a group of scientists who were already talking in low, urgent voices. I hesitated, then followed her, because I did not know where else to go, and because I wanted to understand what had almost happened. The scientists did not stop me from listening. I do not think they even noticed I was there. I stood at the edge of their circle, a small human girl among tall, silver-skinned researchers, and I listened as they argued in fast, technical language that my translators struggled to keep up with. I caught pieces: core resonance, decay pattern, stabilization field, 5,000 years. That number kept coming up, over and over, like a wound they kept touching to see if it still hurt. Eventually, an older alien with faded gray skin and deep lines across his face turned and noticed me standing there. His name, I would later learn, was Dr. Kalen Osa, the head of the entire research division. He looked at me the way someone looks at a bug that has wandered into an important meeting. "You should not be here," he said. "I am sorry," I said. "I heard the alarms. I did not know where else to go." He studied me for a long moment, his old eyes moving over my face like he was trying to decide if I was worth the time it would take to explain anything to me. "You are the human," he said, "the exchange student." "Ellie," I said. "Ellie Morgan." He did not repeat my name. Instead, he turned back to the group, dismissing me with the same ease he might dismiss a passing thought. "This is not a place for children," he said, not looking at me anymore. "Especially not children from a species that has not yet solved fire." A few of the other scientists made a sound that I think was laughter, though it came out strange through the translators, more like static than amusement. My face went hot. I wanted to say something back, something clever, but nothing came to mind fast enough, and by the time I thought of a response, they had already turned away and continued their conversation without me. I walked back to my quarters that night, with my ears still burning. I sat on the edge of my bed, a strange narrow cot built for a body shape that was not quite mine, and I stared at the wall for a long time. "We have not solved fire," I muttered to the empty room. "Sure. Okay." The next morning, I learned more about the lattice, though not because anyone explained it to me directly. I learned it because I was given a tablet full of maintenance logs and told to organize them, which was, I quickly understood, a job designed to keep me busy and out of the way while the real scientists worked on the real problem. The lattice, according to the files, was an ancient structure built long before any of the current alien species had achieved space travel. Nobody knew exactly who built it. It stretched far beyond the station itself, an enormous lattice of energy channels that stabilized the gravity and radiation levels across an entire cluster of star systems. Without it, according to one file I read 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly, entire inhabited worlds would become uninhabitable within a matter of years. Radiation levels would spike. Gravitational fields would become unpredictable. Billions of lives, across dozens of planets, depended on the lattice continuing to function. And the lattice was failing. It had been failing, slowly, unevenly, for 5,000 years. Every alien civilization that had encountered it during that time had tried to fix it. Entire fields of science had been built around studying it. Universities existed only to train new generations of lattice researchers. Religions had formed around it, and in 5,000 years, nobody had solved the problem. They had only managed to slow the decay, patching it again and again, buying a little more time before the next failure, the next groaning shudder through the station, the next flash of blue and white light through the windows. I sat with that tablet in my lap for a long time, thinking about the fear I had seen on Dr. Ashra's face the day before. 5,000 years of fear. 5,000 years of the smartest minds in the galaxy failing to solve the same problem, over and over. That afternoon, I was called into a small briefing room where Dr. Ashra handed me a new set of instructions. My exchange program required me to complete a research assignment before the end of the term. Something small, something appropriate for a first-year human student, she explained. I would be given access to a limited set of records, mostly historical documentation, and asked to write a basic summary report. "It is simple work," she said. "Do not worry about understanding the technical details. That is not expected of you." I looked at the records she handed over. They were old maintenance logs, decades old, buried near the bottom of the station's archive system, the kind of files nobody important would ever bother reading. Busy work. A task designed to keep the human girl occupied without wasting anyone's real time. I almost said something. I almost told her that I understood exactly what she was doing, that I was not a child who needed to be given a coloring book to keep quiet, but I did not say anything. I just took the files and nodded, because arguing would not change anything, and because some small stubborn part of me had already decided something else instead. I decided I was going to read every single file in the entire archive, not just the ones I was assigned. I did not know yet what I would find. I did not know that in less than 48 hours I would understand the lattice problem better than anyone on that station had in 5,000 years. I only knew, sitting there with that tablet in my lap and my face still warm from being laughed at, that I wanted to prove something, not to them, to myself. That night, instead of sleeping, I opened the full archive on my tablet and started reading. I did not know it yet, but I had just started the most important weekend of my life. The archive was enormous, More data than I had ever tried to work through in my life, spanning centuries of research from dozens of different alien species, each with their own scientific traditions, their own units of measurement, their own way of describing the same failing structure above our heads. Most of it made no sense to me at first. The language was dense, formal, full of assumptions I did not share, but I kept reading, because it was easier than lying awake thinking about Dr. Osa's voice telling the others that my species had not solved fire. By the second hour, I noticed something strange. Every research team, across every generation, across every species, seemed to start their work from the exact same starting point. They all assumed the lattice was failing because of decay in its core resonance field, a kind of energy signature that kept the whole structure synchronized. And every single research paper, no matter how advanced, no matter how many centuries of technology separated one from another, tried to solve the problem by strengthening that resonance field. Bigger stabilizers, more precise calibration, more powerful energy sources feeding into the same central point. None of it worked. Every fix bought a little time, and then the decay came back, exactly the same way, exactly on schedule, like a wound that refused to heal, no matter how carefully it was bandaged. I sat back on my narrow cot and stared at the ceiling for a long time, turning the problem over in my head the way I used to turn over a puzzle before bed, back home, back before any of this happened. 5,000 years of the smartest scientists in the galaxy, all trying to solve the same problem the same way, and all failing the same way. Maybe, I thought, the problem was not the resonance field at all. Maybe the problem was that everyone kept trying to fix it, using the same idea, over and over, just with better tools each time. I did not have an answer yet, not that first night. But for the first time since I arrived on Halcyon Array, I did not feel small. I felt like I had noticed something that 5,000 years of brilliant, serious, respected scientists had somehow walked right past. I closed the tablet, finally, somewhere near dawn, my eyes burning from staring at the screen for so long. But even as I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling back through my mind, quiet and stubborn, refusing to let me fully rest. What if they had all been asking the wrong question? I woke up late the next morning with a headache and a tablet still glowing on my chest, its battery nearly drained. It was the start of the weekend, 2 full days, with no scheduled lessons, no assigned tasks beyond the busy work report I had already decided to ignore. Most of the other students on the station, human and alien alike, were planning to spend the time relaxing in the recreation deck or exploring the observation dome. I had other plans. I found Noah Whitfield in the dining hall, eating something orange and jelly-like from a metal tray, looking deeply unimpressed with his breakfast. Noah was the only other human on the station, a quiet, sharp-eyed boy from somewhere in the north of England, here on the same exchange program as me. We had not spoken much during the first week, mostly nodding at each other in hallways, 2 humans surrounded by aliens, unsure how to bridge the gap between polite distance and actual friendship. I sat down across from him without asking and slid my tablet across the table. "I need your brain for a couple of days," I said. He looked up at me, then at the tablet, then back at me. "That is a strange way to ask someone for help," he said. I told him everything, the shaking corridor, the fear on Dr. Ashra's face, Dr. Osa's comment about fire, the mountain of research files, all pointing at the same failed idea, repeated across 5,000 years. Noah listened quietly, chewing his strange orange breakfast, his expression shifting slowly from confusion to interest to something closer to disbelief. "You want to solve a 5,000-year-old problem," he said finally, "over a weekend, using files nobody bothered reading properly. When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous," I said. "It is ridiculous," he said, "which is exactly why I am in." We spent the rest of the morning in an unused study room near the edge of the science wing, a small space with a round table and a wall screen that could display data from the station archive. Nobody stopped us from being there. Nobody seemed to think two human teenagers could cause any real trouble, which, looking back, was probably a mistake on their part. I laid out everything I had found the night before, walking Noah through the pattern I had noticed, the way every research team across every generation kept trying to strengthen the same resonance field, kept assuming the core problem was a matter of power and precision rather than something more basic. Noah listened, nodding slowly, occasionally asking a question that made me stop and think harder about what I actually understood versus what I had simply absorbed from skimming too many files too quickly. "Okay," he said, after I finished. "So if it is not a power problem, what is it?" "I do not know yet," I admitted, "but I think we are looking in the wrong place. Everyone studies the lattice itself. Nobody seems to be studying what the lattice was built to fix in the first place." Noah tilted his head at that, and I could see something click behind his eyes. "You mean the thing underneath it," he said. "The reason it exists at all." "Exactly," I said. We spent the rest of that first day digging through the oldest records we could find, trying to answer a question that, as far as we could tell, nobody had seriously asked in centuries. Why had the lattice been built in the first place? Most modern records simply treated it as a fact of the universe, a structure that had always been there, keeping the region stable. The scientists on the station studied how to maintain it, not why it was needed at all. It was, I realized, a bit like studying a bridge for years without ever asking what river it was built to cross. It took hours of searching before we found anything useful, buried deep in an old archaeological survey conducted by a species that no longer existed, a survey nobody had cited in any of the recent research we had already reviewed. The survey suggested that the region of space around the station had once been extremely unstable, long before the lattice was built, due to the gravitational pull of several massive objects that no longer existed in their original form. The lattice, according to this old and mostly forgotten survey, had not been built to generate stability on its own. It had been built to counteract something else, something that used to be there and, as far as the survey's authors believed, was no longer present in the same way. I read that section 3 times before I fully understood what it meant. "Noah," I said quietly, almost afraid to say it out loud, "what if the thing the lattice was built to counteract is not there anymore?" He looked at me for a long moment, then back at the screen, scrolling through the data with new urgency. "You are saying the lattice is fighting a war against an enemy that already left the battlefield," he said. "That is exactly what I am saying," I said. "Every generation of scientists has been trying to make the shield stronger. Nobody has checked if the thing it is shielding against actually still exists in the same form." We worked through the rest of that day without stopping, forgetting meals, forgetting the recreation deck, forgetting everything except the growing certainty that we had found a thread nobody else had bothered to pull. By evening, we had pulled together enough old gravitational survey data to attempt a rough comparison, mapping the region's current gravitational profile against the ancient records from before the lattice was built. The station's public terminals were not powerful enough to run the kind of calculation we needed, not without drawing attention from the actual science division. So we did the only thing that made sense to 2 stubborn teenagers who did not want to be sent back to their rooms before finishing what they had started. We asked a friend for a favor. Her name was Ilira Vantessa, a young alien student close to our own age, one of the few people on the station who had actually been kind to me during my first week, mostly out of simple curiosity about humans rather than any real belief that I belonged there. Ilira had access to a research terminal in the lower science wing, technically reserved for advanced students, but rarely monitored on weekends. When I explained what we were trying to do, in careful, simplified terms, she stared at me for a long moment, her 3-fingered hand hovering near the door controls. "You want to use restricted equipment," she said, "to test an idea that contradicts 5,000 years of established science, based on a survey from a species that no longer exists." "When you say it like that," I said, "it sounds ridiculous." "It is ridiculous," she said, echoing Noah's exact words from that morning without knowing it. Which is exactly why I am going to help you. We spent that night crowded around a single terminal in the lower science wing, 3 teenagers from 2 different species, running calculations that none of us fully understood how to interpret correctly the first time. Ilira's technical knowledge filled in gaps that Noah and I could not manage on our own, translating the ancient survey data into a format the modern equipment could actually process. It was slow, frustrating work, full of errors and restarts, the kind of thing that would have taken a trained scientist a fraction of the time, except no trained scientist was willing to even consider the question we were asking. Around midnight, the terminal finally produced a result, a rough comparison model showing the predicted gravitational profile of the region without the ancient objects mentioned in the ancient survey, set against the region's actual current profile, still shaped by the lattice. The two did not match. Not exactly, not perfectly, but close enough that all 3 of us went very quiet, staring at the screen, the soft hum of the terminal, the only sound in the room. The lattice is compensating for something that is not fully there anymore, Ilira said quietly, her translator device carrying a strange flatness in her voice that I understood was the sound of someone experiencing genuine shock. It has been overcorrecting. For a very long time. That is why the fixes never last, I said, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. Every generation strengthens the resonance field, but the resonance field was never the actual source of the imbalance. They have been treating a symptom for 5,000 years and calling it a cure. Noah let out a long breath and rubbed his face with both hands. So how do we prove it? He said. I looked at the clock display on the terminal wall. It was well past midnight now, the first day of our weekend already gone, swallowed by hours of reading and searching, and slowly realizing that we had stumbled onto something far bigger than either of us had expected when I first slid my tablet across a breakfast table that morning. We do not just prove it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We fix it. Ilira looked at me like I had lost my mind, which, in fairness, was probably a reasonable reaction. Noah just grinned, the exhausted, slightly unhinged grin of someone who had stopped sleeping properly and had decided to simply enjoy the ride instead of fighting it. We have 1 day left, he said. 1 weekend to solve what 5,000 years of scientists could not. When you say it like that, I said, it sounds ridiculous. All 3 of us said it together, at the exact same time, and for the first time since the alarms had gone off in that corridor 2 days earlier, I actually laughed. It felt strange, laughing in the middle of something so serious, but it also felt necessary, like a pressure valve releasing just enough to let us keep going. We did not sleep that night. There was too much left to do, and somewhere underneath my exhaustion, a small, stubborn voice kept reminding me that the shaking corridor could happen again at any moment, that somewhere below us, the lattice was still overcorrecting for a threat that no longer fully existed, wearing itself down, trying to fight a battle that had already ended centuries ago without anyone realizing it. We had 1 day left to turn a discovery into a solution. And none of us had any idea yet just how close we actually were. By the time the station's artificial morning lights brightened in the lower science wing, the 3 of us looked like we had been through a small war. Ilira's normally smooth silver skin had taken on a dull gray tint that I would later learn was the alien equivalent of exhaustion. Noah had fallen asleep, sitting upright for almost 20 minutes before jerking awake and insisting he had simply been thinking with his eyes closed. My own eyes felt like they had sand in them, and my hands were shaking slightly from too much caffeine substitute and not enough real sleep. But none of that mattered anymore, because we finally understood the shape of the problem, even if we did not yet understand how to fix it. The lattice was not broken. That was the first thing we had to accept, the idea that felt almost impossible to say out loud after everything we had read about 5,000 years of failed repairs. The lattice was working exactly as it had been designed to work. It was simply working against a threat that had faded away centuries ago, still pouring enormous amounts of energy into compensating for a gravitational imbalance that barely existed anymore. Every attempt to strengthen the resonance field had only made the overcorrection worse, forcing the structure to work harder against a threat that was mostly gone, which explained why every fix eventually failed in the exact same way. The system was not decaying from weakness. It was straining itself from doing far more work than it actually needed to do. That is like flooring the accelerator in a car that is already parked, Noah said, rubbing his eyes. The engine is not broken. It is just being told to do something it does not need to do anymore. Illyra tilted her head at the comparison, clearly translating the idea of a car into something closer to her own experience, but she nodded slowly once she understood. So the solution is not to strengthen the field, she said. The solution is to reduce what the field is being asked to do. Exactly, I said. We do not need a bigger shield. We need to tell the shield the fight is already over. It sounded simple when I said it out loud. It was not simple at all. Reducing the resonance field's output meant recalibrating a system that had never, in 5,000 years, been intentionally reduced in scale. Every single record we had access to described attempts to increase power, improve precision, or replace failing components with stronger versions. Nobody had ever tried scaling the entire system down, because nobody had ever questioned whether the original threat was still present in full force. We are going to need real equipment, Illyra said. Not a study terminal, something connected to the actual control systems for the lattice. That is restricted, I said. Extremely restricted, she agreed. Which means if we are caught, this stops being a funny story about ambitious students and becomes a very serious problem for all three of us. I looked at Noah. He looked back at me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, both of us silently asking the same question. Was this worth the risk? Was a rough theory, built from old survey data and one very long, very tired night of calculations, worth breaking rules that could get us sent home? Or worse. I thought about the shaking corridor. I thought about the fear on Dr. Ashra's face, a face that had clearly seen this exact same shaking, this exact same fear, more times than she probably wanted to remember. I thought about 5,000 years of brilliant scientists patching the same wound over and over, never once stepping back far enough to ask whether they were treating the right injury at all. We are doing this, I said. Illyra let out a long breath through her nose, a sound I had learned meant she was steadying her nerves rather than actually disagreeing. There is a secondary control terminal near the lower maintenance corridor, she said. It is used for diagnostic testing, not for actual system changes. It should let us run a simulation using real lattice data without touching the live system directly. Should, Noah repeated. Should, Illyra confirmed. I have never actually used it before. We moved through the station quietly, sticking to corridors that were mostly empty during the early weekend hours, when most of the research staff preferred to sleep in rather than start their shifts early. Illyra led the way with quiet confidence, occasionally pressing her palm against sensor panels that recognized her student credentials, opening doors that I suspected we technically were not supposed to be walking through. The diagnostic terminal room was smaller than I expected, tucked into a narrow space between two larger control rooms, filled with humming equipment, and a single large display screen currently showing a slow, steady stream of numbers scrolling past faster than I could read them. Illyra sat down at the main console and began working, her fingers moving quickly across controls designed for a hand shape different from mine, occasionally muttering something under her breath that I assumed was a small alien curse word. It took almost an hour to properly connect our rough calculations from the night before into a format the diagnostic system could actually simulate. Every few minutes, something would fail to load correctly, or a formula would produce an error message none of us fully understood, and we would have to backtrack, checking our work again and again, terrified of making a mistake that would waste the little time we had left. Around midday, the simulation finally ran. The screen filled with a slow, complex model of the lattice, rendered in soft blue light, its structure pulsing gently in rhythm with a resonance frequency displayed as a wavy line along the bottom of the display. Beside it, a second line appeared, representing our proposed reduction, a gentler, calmer wave that required significantly less energy output to maintain. According to the simulation, if the resonance field was gradually reduced to match the actual current gravitational conditions in the region, rather than the outdated conditions from 5,000 years ago, the overall stability of the lattice would not weaken. It would improve dramatically. The structure would stop straining itself against a threat that had mostly faded away, and in doing so, it would stop generating the same repeated stress fractures that had caused every previous failure, including the one we had felt shaking the corridor floor beneath our feet only 2 days earlier. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The three of us just stared at the screen, at that calmer, steadier blue wave, replacing 5,000 years of desperate overcorrection with something that finally looked like balance. "It works," Noah said quietly, like he was afraid saying it too loudly might make it stop being true. "It works in a simulation," Illyra corrected, though even she could not fully hide the excitement creeping into her voice. "We do not know if it would actually work on the real structure." "We should tell someone," I said. "Dr. Ashra. Someone who can actually check this properly." That was the responsible answer, and I meant it when I said it. But responsibility and reality do not always move at the same speed, and reality, in this case, had other plans. The alarms went off again before any of us could leave the room. This time, the shaking started almost immediately, far stronger than the tremor from 2 days earlier. Strong enough to knock a small piece of loose equipment off a shelf and send it clattering across the floor. The diagnostic terminal screen flickered, warning symbols replacing the calm blue simulation we had just been staring at in amazement. "Core resonance failure detected," a calm automated voice announced through the room's speakers, the words carrying a strange contrast against the very real panic building in my chest. "Emergency stabilization protocols initiating." "We have to get out of here," Illyra said, already moving toward the door. "Wait," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen, on numbers that were falling far faster than anything we had seen in the earlier archive records. "This is not like before. Look at the decay rate." Illyra paused at the door, glancing back at the screen, her expression shifting from urgency to something closer to alarm. "That is nearly triple the previous failure rate," she said. "The overcorrection is accelerating," I said, the pieces snapping together in my exhausted mind, even as the room continued to shake around us. Every time the system strains itself, trying to fight a threat that is not really there anymore, it gets a little weaker. The failures have been getting worse. We just did not have enough data to see the pattern until now. Noah gripped the edge of the console to steady himself as another tremor rolled through the floor. "How long until it actually breaks completely?" he asked, his voice tight. "I do not know," I admitted. "But if the pattern holds, not much longer." The automated stabilization protocols kicked in a moment later, exactly the way they had 2 days earlier, pouring more energy into the resonance field, strengthening the very overcorrection that our simulation had just proven was the actual source of the problem. The shaking slowed, then stopped, the same way it had before, the emergency system doing exactly what it had been designed to do for 5,000 years, treating the symptom, buying a little more time, while the real injury underneath continued to worsen. We stood there in the sudden silence after the tremor stopped, breathing hard, hearts pounding, staring at each other in the aftermath. "That confirms it," I said quietly. "Every automated fix makes it slightly worse in the long run. We do not have 5,000 years left to keep patching this the old way. Based on how fast that decay rate is climbing, I do not think we even have 5,000 days." Illyra's translator carried a small tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with the shaking floor. "Then we do not have time to wait for someone to believe us either," she said. I looked at the simulation results, still glowing on the screen, at the calm blue wave that represented an answer nobody in 5,000 years had thought to try, and I looked at Noah, exhausted, wide-eyed, and somehow still grinning despite everything. "We are not going to wait," I said. "We are going to write this up properly, right now, with every piece of data we have, and we are going to bring it straight to Dr. Ashra ourselves, before the next tremor happens. And if she does not believe 3 tired teenagers who broke into a restricted terminal, Noah asked. Then we make her believe us, I said, because I am done being treated like busy work. We spent the next several hours doing the hardest, most careful work of the entire weekend, organizing every scrap of evidence into something that could actually be understood by someone outside our small, sleep-deprived circle. Ilira translated our human-style explanations into proper scientific terminology. Noah built a clean, simple version of the simulation that could run without needing the restricted diagnostic terminal. I wrote out the entire chain of reasoning from the beginning: the ancient survey, the mismatch in gravitational data, the pattern of accelerating failures, step by step, in language simple enough that even someone who had already decided humans could not solve basic problems would not be able to dismiss it without actually reading it first. By the time we finished, the station's artificial evening lights were beginning to dim, and all 3 of us were running on nothing but nerves and the growing, terrifying certainty that we had found something real, something that mattered far more than any grade or approval we had originally been chasing. "We are really doing this," Noah said, staring at the finished report glowing on the screen in front of us. I thought about the shaking corridor. I thought about Dr. Osa's laughter. I thought about 5,000 years of careful, respected, brilliant scientists who had never once questioned the one assumption that had been quietly breaking their world a little more each generation. "We are really doing this," I agreed. None of us slept again that night. We spent it instead rehearsing exactly what we would say, preparing for every possible objection, every possible dismissal, because we all understood, without needing to say it out loud, that we would probably only get one chance to be taken seriously. Morning would bring Dr. Ashra and Dr. Osa and every ounce of doubt they had already shown me on my very first day. But it would also bring the proof, the data, and the calm, steady blue wave sitting quietly on our screen, waiting to prove that sometimes the biggest problems are not solved by working harder at the same wrong idea, but by someone new finally being willing to ask an old idea a new question. I found Dr. Ashra in her office early that morning, before most of the station had properly woken up, hunched over a stack of reports with the tired, worn expression of someone who had spent the entire night dealing with the aftermath of the tremor. She looked up when I knocked on her open door, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face that might have been surprise at seeing me there so early, uninvited. "I need you to look at something," I said, before she could tell me to come back later. "It is about the lattice." Her expression shifted immediately, tiredness sharpening into something more guarded. "Ellie," she said carefully, "I know the tremor yesterday was frightening, but this is not something you need to worry about. It is being handled by people with the proper training." I stepped further into the room instead of leaving, and set the tablet down on her desk, the report still glowing on the screen, the calm blue wave sitting quietly at the center of the display. "I think I found the reason the fixes never last," I said. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched her decide whether to humor me or simply dismiss me outright. To her credit, she picked up the tablet. I do not know exactly what changed in her expression as she scrolled through the first few pages, whether it was the ancient survey data, or the gravitational mismatch, or the accelerating decay pattern we had documented from the tremor itself. But somewhere around the 3rd page, her posture changed completely. She sat up straighter, her 4 fingers stopped scrolling and simply hovered over the screen, still, as if she had forgotten they were there at all. "Where did you get this survey?" she asked quietly, without looking up. "The archive," I said, "buried near the bottom. Nobody has cited it in centuries." She read for a long time after that, silent, her eyes moving quickly across each page, occasionally scrolling backward to reread a section, her breathing slow and careful in a way that told me she was working very hard to stay calm. "This cannot be right," she finally said, though her voice did not carry the certainty the words were supposed to hold. "Run the simulation yourself," I said. We built it using the diagnostic terminal in the lower science wing. It matches the actual tremor data from yesterday almost exactly." She looked up at me sharply. "You accessed a restricted terminal," she said. I did not flinch. "Yes," I said, "because I did not think anyone would listen to me otherwise. I still might be wrong about all of this, but I do not think I am, and I would rather be wrong in front of you than stay quiet and watch this station shake apart a little more every few days until it finally breaks completely." Dr. Ashra sat very still for a long moment, staring at me with an expression I could not fully read, something caught between disbelief and the beginning of real consideration. Then, without another word, she stood, gathered the tablet, and walked briskly out of the office. "Come with me," she said over her shoulder. I followed her through the corridors, my heart pounding, half expecting to be marched straight into some kind of disciplinary meeting for the restricted terminal. Instead, she led me directly to the main research division, a large open chamber filled with active workstations and a massive central display showing a live readout of the lattice's current condition. Dr. Osa was there, along with several other senior researchers, all gathered around a table discussing the aftermath of the tremor in tense, clipped voices. Dr. Ashra walked straight up to the table and set the tablet down in the middle of it, interrupting the conversation entirely. "I need everyone to look at this," she said. Dr. Osa glanced at the tablet, then at me standing awkwardly behind Dr. Ashra, and his expression immediately soured. "Vel," he said, his voice tight with impatience, "we do not have time for the human child's homework assignment right now." "This is not a homework assignment," Dr. Ashra said, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "This is a working theory that matches yesterday's tremor data with a level of precision our own models have not achieved in 5,000 years. The room went quiet. Every scientist at the table turned to look at the tablet, then at Dr. Ashra, then, slowly, uncertainly, at me. Dr. Osa picked up the tablet himself this time, his expression skeptical, clearly expecting to find some obvious flaw within the first page that would let him dismiss the whole thing and return to whatever conversation I had interrupted. He did not find that flaw on the first page. I watched his skepticism slowly give way to something else as he kept reading, his old eyes narrowing, his mouth pressing into a thin, unreadable line. "This survey," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, "this is not standard archive material. Where did this come from?" "A species that no longer exists," I said. "It was filed centuries ago and never referenced again by anyone still active in the field." He looked up at me properly for the first time since I had arrived on the station, and for a moment I saw something shift behind his eyes, an old certainty cracking just slightly under the weight of new information. "You are suggesting the entire resonance model has been built on a false assumption," he said. "I am suggesting the threat the lattice was built to counteract is mostly gone," I said, "and every attempt to strengthen the field has been fighting a battle that ended a very long time ago. That is why every fix works for a while and then fails again. You have not been healing a wound, you have been reopening it every time you try to bandage it more tightly." Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. I could hear the soft hum of the equipment, the quiet rustle of someone shifting their weight nervously nearby, the distant sound of station traffic continuing outside the chamber, entirely unaware that everything inside this room had just changed. "Run the simulation," Dr. Ashra said finally, breaking the silence. "Run it properly, on the full system, not just the diagnostic terminal. If she is wrong, we lose an afternoon. If she is right, we may have just found the first real answer to this problem in 5,000 years. Dr. Osa hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tablet. I understood, in that moment, exactly what he was feeling, though I did not fully sympathize with it yet. He had spent his entire life, his entire career, inside a field built around a problem that had never been solved. Every mentor he had ever studied under, every generation of researchers before him, had approached that problem the same way, and all of them had failed the same way. accepting that the answer might have been sitting quietly in an unread survey, waiting for someone new enough, stubborn enough, or simply unbothered enough by 5,000 years of tradition to actually look at it properly, was not a small thing to accept. "Run it," he said finally, quietly. "Full system simulation, immediately." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity, unlike anything I had experienced during my entire time on the station. Every senior researcher in the room dropped what they had been working on and turned their full attention to the simulation, running our proposed reduction against the complete, real-time data feed from the actual lattice structure rather than the limited diagnostic model we had used the day before. I stood at the edge of the room the entire time, Noah and Elira eventually joining me after Dr. Ashra sent word for them to be brought in as well, since their names appeared throughout the report as well. Nobody dismissed us this time. Nobody laughed. The room had shifted from skepticism into something closer to focused, disciplined urgency. The same urgency I imagine had driven every previous generation of researchers who had tried, and failed, to solve this exact same problem. The full simulation took nearly 3 hours to complete, each minute stretching longer than the last as we waited, none of us saying much, all of us watching the central display as it slowly processed years of data through our proposed model. When the results finally appeared, the room went completely silent. The calm blue wave from our small diagnostic simulation reappeared on the massive central display, scaled up to the full complexity of the real lattice structure, and it held. It did not flicker. It did not degrade under the added weight of real, complete data the way every previous theoretical model in the archive eventually had. According to the simulation, a controlled gradual reduction of the resonance field, matched carefully to the region's actual current gravitational conditions, would not only stop the accelerating failures we had witnessed firsthand, it would allow the lattice to stabilize completely, likely for the first time in over 5,000 years. Dr. Osa stood very still in front of the display for a long time, staring at that calm blue wave, his expression unreadable. 5,000 years, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 5,000 years, and the answer was never about making the shield stronger. It was about recognizing the war had already ended. He turned slowly to look at me, and for the first time since I had arrived on Halcyon Array, I did not see dismissal in his eyes. I saw something closer to disbelief, mixed with a kind of quiet, painful humility that I suspect had not come easily to a man who had spent his entire life certain of his own expertise. "I owe you an apology," he said. "On my first day, I said your species had not solved fire. I was wrong to say that. I was wrong about a great many things, it seems." I did not know what to say to that, standing there exhausted, still wearing the same clothes I had put on 2 days earlier, surrounded by scientists whose entire careers had just been quietly, gently upended by a report written by 3 sleep-deprived teenagers who had simply refused to accept that a 5,000-year-old assumption was too sacred to question. "I just wanted to help," I said finally, because it was the only thing that felt true enough to say. Dr. Ashra placed a steady hand on my shoulder, her earlier caution replaced by something warmer, something that looked almost like pride. "You did far more than help," she said. "You solved what we could not." Behind her, on the massive display, the calm blue wave continued to hold steady, a quiet, patient answer to a question that had taken 5,000 years and one very long, very ordinary weekend to finally understand. The controlled reduction of the lattice's resonance field did not happen all at once, Dr. Osa explained, once the initial shock of the simulation results had settled, that a structure of that size and importance could not simply be adjusted overnight, no matter how confident the models appeared. The station spent the following weeks running careful, incremental tests, lowering the field output in small, measured steps, watching closely for any sign that our theory might be wrong, that some hidden danger might still be lurking in the region the ancient survey claimed had gone quiet centuries ago. It was not wrong. Each small reduction brought the calm blue wave a little steadier, a little more balanced, the wild, exhausting overcorrection finally easing after 5,000 years of unnecessary strain. The tremors that had shaken the station every few days grew further and further apart, then stopped entirely. By the end of the first month, the lattice's resonance field had settled into a pattern more stable than any recorded reading in the station's entire historical archive. I was there for most of it, invited now instead of tolerated, sitting alongside Dr. Ashra and Dr. Osa as they walked through each incremental adjustment, asking questions I never would have imagined being allowed to ask during my first week on the station. Noah and Elira were there too, all three of us, slowly transitioning from a strange, sleep-deprived weekend project into something closer to actual junior members of the research team, though none of us fully understood the size of what we had done until much later, when the reports began to spread. News of the discovery did not stay contained to Halcyon Array for long. The lattice was not simply a piece of local station equipment. It stabilized an entire cluster of star systems, home to dozens of inhabited worlds, each one relying on its continued function without most of their populations ever fully understanding how close that stability had come to failing completely. Word of a solution, especially one that had solved a problem their greatest scientists had failed to crack for 5,000 years, spread through the wider alien community faster than any of us expected. I remember the first time I saw my own name mentioned in an official communication from outside the station, a formal message from a planetary science council located several systems away, requesting further details about the human researcher responsible for identifying the resonance flaw. I read that message 3 times, sitting alone in my quarters, feeling a strange mixture of pride and disbelief that refused to fully settle into anything I recognized. Dr. Ashra found me there, a short while later, holding the tablet, staring at the message like it might change into something less overwhelming if I looked at it long enough. "You are going to receive a great deal more of these," she said gently, sitting down across from me. "The council wants to formally recognize your contribution. There will be requests for interviews. Other stations will want to consult you directly on similar problems." "I am 17, I said. "I still do not fully understand half of what we did." Dr. Ashra allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuinely warm expression I had seen from her since the tremor 2 months earlier. "Neither did anyone else, for 5,000 years, she said. "That did not stop you from looking closer than the rest of us were willing to look." The formal recognition ceremony took place several weeks later, in the largest gathering hall on Halcyon Array, filled with representatives from across the Science Council, along with delegates from several of the worlds directly protected by the lattice. I stood at the front of that hall, Noah and Elira beside me, all 3 of us dressed in unfamiliar formal attire that felt stiff and strange against skin that had spent the previous 2 months in worn-out work clothes and too little sleep. Dr. Osa spoke first, addressing the gathered crowd with none of the dismissive coldness he had shown me on my very first day. He spoke instead about humility, about the danger of certainty, about how easily an entire field of brilliant, dedicated scientists could spend 5,000 years walking past the answer simply because tradition had taught them exactly where to look and exactly where not to. "We built an entire civilization of careful, respected experts around this problem," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "And it took someone who had not yet been taught which questions were considered acceptable to ask, to finally ask the right one." He turned to look directly at me as he said that last part, and for the first time, standing in front of an entire hall of alien scientists and dignitaries, I did not feel small. I did not feel like a curiosity, or a mistake, or a child who did not belong. I felt, simply, like myself, the same stubborn girl who had once sat awake all night with a tablet glowing on her chest, refusing to accept that a mountain of unread files was not worth reading properly. After the ceremony, Once the formal speeches had ended and the hall had slowly filled with quieter, more casual conversation, Dr. Ashra found me near a large window overlooking the section of space where the lattice hung steady and calm above the station, its structure finally at rest after 5,000 years of unnecessary strain. "How does it feel?" she asked, standing beside me, watching the same view. "Strange," I admitted. "I did not come here trying to save anyone. I just wanted to prove I was not as small as everyone kept treating me." "Sometimes those are the same thing," she said. "The people who change the most are rarely trying to change everything. They are usually just refusing to accept being told they cannot." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the lattice glow softly above us, steady now in a way it had never been during my entire time on the station. "There is something else," I said finally. "While we were going through the old survey data, I found a reference to another structure, much further out, built by the same unknown species. Nobody has ever properly studied it. The note said it stopped responding to standard diagnostics almost 2,000 years ago, and everyone simply assumed it had gone dormant naturally." Dr. Ashra turned to look at me slowly, an expression somewhere between amusement and genuine alarm creeping across her face. "Ellie," she said carefully, "please tell me you are not already planning your next weekend project." I looked back out at the window, at the calm, steady glow of the lattice, at the quiet stars stretching endlessly beyond it, and I could not quite stop the small, stubborn smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. I did not answer her directly. I did not need to. She already knew the answer, the same way Noah and Elira already knew, the same way, I suspected, the entire station was slowly beginning to understand about humans in general. We were not the primitive newcomers they had once assumed us to be. We were simply people who had never been taught that some questions were too old, too sacred, or too impossible to ask again. Somewhere across the Science Council records, a formal report was already being filed, one that would later become required reading for new researchers joining stations across the region. Its title was simple, almost understated, given everything it represented. It read only this: Human Research Methodology, an unexpected asset, requiring further study and further caution. I never did see the exact wording of the internal recommendation that followed shortly after, quietly circulated among senior staff on stations throughout the region, advising increased oversight whenever human students were given unsupervised access to long weekends and unread archives. I only heard about it secondhand, from Ilira, who found the entire idea endlessly amusing. "They are afraid of what you might find next," she told me one evening, not long after the ceremony, as the three of us sat together in the same small study room where this entire strange journey had first begun. "Good," I said, smiling for the first time in what felt like a very long while. "They should be." Outside the window, the lattice continued to glow steady and calm, a 5,000-year-old problem finally at rest, solved not by more power or more precision, or another generation of careful, respected tradition, but by one ordinary weekend, one stubborn refusal to accept an old assumption, and 3 tired teenagers who simply decided to keep asking questions long after everyone else had stopped.